Hello everybody and welcome to the 12th video in our series of videos on war and peace in Europe between the years of 1920 and 1945, and this will be our third video on World War II. So today we will be looking at the German invasion of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union responded. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this presentation, you guys should know what Operation Barbarossa was and when it was launched. You guys should know 4 facts about the Battle of Stalingrad. And finally, you guys should know why the German offensive into Russia failed. As we know, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in August of 1939. And which they stated that they wouldn't engage in war for 10 years, and they cooperated in the invasion of Poland. However, Hitler had been adamant in his hatred of communism and the idea of his Greater German Empire, or Großdeutschland, and how it needed a Lebensraum or living space to feed the empire meant that he always intended to take Soviet territory. This was all part of his foreign policy aims. So the plan to attack the Soviet Union was known as Operation Barbarossa, and on the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa when 3 million German troops entered Soviet territory without a declaration of war. The Germans launched a 3-pronged attack directed first at North Army at Leningrad, the Middle Army at Moscow, and the South Army at Kiev, Stalingrad, and ultimately the Caucasus oil fields in the south. Stalin had refused to believe reports that the invasion had taken place, and the German blitzkrieg tactics, they really stunned the Soviet troops, and they scored the Germans brilliant successes. By September, Kiev, marked here, fell in the south, and Leningrad in the north was cut off and was being besieged, and this siege of Leningrad would actually last for 1,000 days. Hitler had calculated that all of European Russia, as far as the Ural Mountains, as you can see marked here, would be taken before winter set in. However, Operation Barbarossa had been delayed or stalled due to the Germans having to divert troops to Greece and to Yugoslavia in March and April of 1941, which we saw in the last video. So, despite huge victories for the Germans, they couldn't resupply their army fast enough to keep moving. And Stalin introduced a policy known as Scorched Earth, which was destroying anything useful in the path of the enemy, such as food or shelter or equipment. He was also ruthless with his own army, and anybody who tried to turn away and run from the fighting was immediately shot by troops stationed behind the front lines. So in November, the weather began to really deteriorate, and by December, winter set in Russia, and the German offensive was stopped. There was no real fighting again until really the summer of the next year. So the most famous and decisive battle of possibly the entire war took place the following year at Stalingrad. The Germans launched a fresh offensive in the summer of 1942. They had a clear route to the Caucasus oil fields, which you can see are around this area here. However, a large portion of the army was peeled off to besiege Stalingrad, which was a relatively unimportant city strategically, but because it bore the name of the Soviet leader, Hitler believed that it had symbolic meaning to take the city. So the attack on Stalingrad began on the 22nd of August 1942. The German army was controlled by General von Paulus, and they ended up fighting vicious street battles with the Russians. And sometimes they would be taken building by building by building. It really was just vicious hand-to-hand combat. It deteriorated into. By October, the Germans had actually taken most of Stalingrad. But supplies were becoming short for the Germans, while Stalin insisted that the city shouldn't be lost, and he reinforced the city with troops and supplies that were ferried across the river Volga, as you can see here, which is Stalingrad is situated on at night. However, things were to turn, and on the 19th of November, the Soviet Union, led by General Zhukov, launched a counter-offensive, attacking from the sides, and they encircled the entire German army, known as the German Sixth Army, who were now trapped in the city they had been trying to take. Hitler refused to allow his army to withdraw, and he tried to resupply them with airdrops, but it wasn't enough to stop the army from starving. And finally, on the 31st of January 1943, against Hitler's orders, General von Paulus surrendered. It's believed that about 750,000 German soldiers were killed at the Battle of Stalingrad, with a further 100,000 surrendering, while about 500,000, possibly up to 1 million Soviet troops were killed, and as much as 40,000 civilians were killed also. But this was a major turning point in the war. It was the first real defeat. The Germans, they never recovered from losing nearly 1 million soldiers at this crucial stage of the war. After the defeat, Germany attempted to launch another major offensive in the spring of 1943, just after von Paulus had surrendered. And while it was initially successful, they were defeated at the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943, which is to this day is the largest tank battle that was ever fought in history. The losses were enormous on both sides. Russians had over 3,000 tanks, Germans had 2,700 tanks, and like I said, the losses were huge. But eventually Germany withdrew, and from here on out they were no longer attacking or trying to gain more land in Russia. They were instead in a defensive position. So why did the German offensive fail? It failed for three main reasons. They delayed the start of the campaign, and this delay meant that Germany couldn't deal the knockout blow before the winter set in, when they had Russia on the ropes. Had the campaign started a few months earlier, Russia would have been even less prepared, and Germany would have had more time to push the Russians back to the Ural Mountains, which would have been acted as a natural barrier for them to be able to defend. Second, Russia had a massively superior manpower and could replace dead soldiers from a vast population, whereas Germany had a limited amount they could replace. It wasn't as easy for them to replace soldiers. Russia had a massive population. The final thing was it was Hitler's insistence on taking the strategically unimportant Stalingrad. This was a massive blunder, and the fact that they didn't take the Caucasus, the oil fields there, would end up costing them in the long run, because this would have been a fantastic oil supply for them to continue their war. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know what Operation Barbarossa was and when it was launched. You guys should know 4 facts about the Battle of Stalingrad. And finally, you guys should know why the German offensive failed. Those 3 examples that were just given there. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.